So welcome to the Insight Meditation Community of Charlotte. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of the 6 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading on Wednesday nights. Welcome to all of you on Zoom. The week of Christmas is always a low attendance night. We have, looks like 19 people on Zoom and 14 in the room, so 33. That's high for a holiday week. Welcome. Tomorrow is the winter solstice. Everybody have their plans made. Starting Friday, we get longer days, more daylight. So this evening, I want to share a little bit about my experience with insight meditation. And maybe you'll be interested in my experiences, but my real objective is to offer some opportunities so that you can have more meaningful experiences with your practice. So insight meditation, in my mind, occupies an unusual place in the landscape of spirituality. Some people would even say insight meditation is not spirituality. That's a different conversation for a different night, but I understand it to be a spiritual path. But unlike most spiritual paths, it's not a religion. And in part, that explains how I ended up as an insight meditation practitioner. So I was raised in a Christian household. We were Lutherans. And by the time I was 16, I was pretty clear that that was not the path for me. So I asked our minister to please remove my name from the rolls of the church, which was, you know, when you're 16, you're really smart. And so for the next couple of decades, I really had no interest in religion or spirituality. And after some time, I found that I was experiencing a growing interest in creating some spiritual dimension to my life. And I'd been introduced to the Quakers while I was attending Guilford College, which is a Quaker college in Greensboro. And my experience with them was positive. So I began attending the Quaker meeting here in Charlotte. And for over a decade, I was really active there. I'm still a member, and I still dearly love the people in that community. So this marks my 25th year of practicing insight meditation. And once I found this path, I knew that really this was the right one for me. And I'll just tell you a quick story. A couple of you have already heard this, but the reason I ended up knowing about insight meditation, Clyde, Alexander, and I were in an introduction to meditation class, and he gave me a brochure. He said, "Have you ever heard of this place called Southern Dharma?" I said, "No." He gave it to me. It's a retreat center in the mountains near Asheville, and I signed up and went to a retreat, and the rest is history. So back to this unusual place that insight meditation occupies in the spiritual landscape. So all the major religions have a meditative element or a meditative sect. And because insight meditation is based on the teachings of the Buddha, it's often associated with the Buddhist religion, but it's not quite that simple. So as a matter of information, I personally don't identify as a Buddhist. I find that it creates confusion because most people understand that to mean that you're a member of the Buddhist religion, which I'm not. And I prefer to say that I'm a student of the teachings of the Buddha. Like most religions, Buddhism has many different sects, and some place more emphasis on meditation than others. In the meditative component of the Buddhist religion, here in the West, there are really 3 main groups. Some of you know this. Zen, Tibetan, and Theravadan. And insight meditation is associated with the Theravadan tradition. So I'm going to talk about why insight meditation meets my needs, but please don't hear what I'm saying as a criticism or a dismissal of any other tradition. There's something for everybody out there. And the important thing is that each of us find what meets our needs. So in my limited exposure to Zen, I have found it to be too structured to suit me. Gail and I were in San Francisco, and we visited the San Francisco Zen Center. They were very welcoming. We enjoyed our visit. But as we were leaving, one of the greeters pulled us aside, and she said, well, we had brought our own cushions. She said, now, if you're going to continue to attend, you'll need to get black cushions because that's what we prefer, and your purple cushions really won't fit in here. We were just visiting, but that's a level of structure that's not comfortable for me, but it's comfortable for some people. Again, my limited exposure to Tibetan Buddhism, I'm aware of their emphasis on ritual. Now, we're not free from ritual here. Many people will bow at the end of a meditation period, and we have other little rituals. But they're not the center, they're not central to our practice. And so I find an element of ritual to be useful, but I don't have such a high tolerance for it. So when we look at this third major tradition in the West, Theravada, that's where we find insight meditation. To be clear, almost all Theravadan nuns and monks are religious Buddhists. I have a great admiration for the nuns and monks. The suttas that we study today would not be here. They would not be available had these people not preserved them and protected them over the many generations. Many of the most accomplished Theravadan scholars and practitioners are religious Buddhists. But with insight meditation, our understanding maybe broadens a little bit from that. We understand that the Buddha didn't set out to found a religion. What he set out to do was to share with others what he had learned about how the mind works and how we can live in a way that creates less suffering for ourselves and others. And these teachings are referred to as the Dharma or the Dhamma. The religious overlay came later, and these teachings stand on their own without the religious overlay. The Buddha's teachings, the Dharma, work equally well for those of any religion or of no religion. And that's the reason that IMC Charlotte, this group, is organized as an educational nonprofit, not a religious nonprofit. So I want to talk about three particular things that I love about insight meditation that keep me coming back, draw me to it. And that is its focus on our personal experience, some element of humility, and then its expression of confidence in us as practitioners. So as to our own personal experience, the Buddha really encouraged his followers to rely on that, to rely on what they could verify. So unlike religion, we're not asked to accept anything on faith. Now, the Pali word saddha is often translated as faith, and you will sometimes hear the term faith used in the context of insight meditation. I think a better translation is confidence. For me, it's the confidence that arises from decades of testing the Dharma in my own experience. When I encounter a teaching that doesn't quite comport with my personal experience. I don't necessarily just dismiss it. I kind of put it aside and wait and see if maybe there's some further uh, insight or wisdom on my end that might make this all fit together correctly. And I hadn't been disappointed in that. So there's a sutta some of y'all will be familiar with, a teaching of the Buddha called the Kalama Sutta. So the Buddha arrives in this village, and the villagers, the Kalamas, are confused and they're frustrated. They told him that they had seen this constant stream of ascetics passing through, and each one of them would denounce all the teachings of the people that had gone before them and say that only their version was correct. And they said to the Buddha, they said, how do we know what to believe? And the Buddha said, well, you've asked a good question. It is a confusing situation. So I'm going to read you just maybe 4 sentences, which is his response to them. It's a little wordy, but try to stay with it. Kalamas do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reasoned cogitation, by the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by the seeming competence of a speaker, or because you think this ascetic is our guru. But when you know for yourselves, these things are wholesome, these things are blameless, these things are praised by the wise, these things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to welfare and happiness, then you should live in accordance with them. Now, the first time I heard that, I misunderstood it as giving us, everybody, complete liberty to kind of understand it any way you want and kind of do as you please. And I think that a lot of people have that experience. The Theravadan monk, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, says it well. He says, although this discourse is often cited as the Buddha's carte blanche for following one's own sense of right and wrong, it actually says something much more rigorous than that. Traditions are not to be followed simply because they are traditions. Reports, such as historical accounts or news, are not to be followed simply because the sources seem reliable. One's own preferences are not to be followed simply because they seem logical or resonate with one's feelings. Instead, any view or belief must be tested by the results it yields when put into practice. And to guard against the possibility of any biases or limitations in one's understanding of those results, they must further be checked against the experience of people who are wise. So that puts it in a little different perspective, more useful, I think. So clearly, it would be much simpler to just proceed on faith, believing what we are told the way some, not all, some religions do. We don't choose this path because it's the easy way. It requires serious commitment and significant effort. So a second characteristic of insight meditation practice is humility. So we must not think that our most recent insight is the end of the story, and now we have all the answers. There is always more to be revealed. I'll share one more story. This is of a monk who learned a lesson in humility. Ajahn Sumedho is a highly respected Theravadan monk. In his book, The Sound of Silence, he recounts a story from early in his life. Years ago, I became very confused when I found out that one of our American Buddhist nuns had left our community and become a born-again Christian. I had just said to another nun, She's really wonderful. She's so wise, so pure-hearted. She'll be a great inspiration to you in your nun's life. I was really embarrassed and confused when I heard the news. I thought, how could she fall for it? I remember asking my teacher, Ajahn Chah, how could she do that? So the answer from Ajahn Chah was, maybe she's right. We must not let our views, no matter how sincere and how seemingly correct, lure us into a place of arrogance. And this is another thing I love about insight meditation practice. It reminds us to stay humble. Now, when we speak of the Dharma as being the teachings of the Buddha, that's not exactly the whole story. And this is an indication of his humility. In one sutta, he tells of discovering a deep truth which is central to the Dharma. He alone has seen this truth. So no one would have challenged him if he had claimed it as his own truth. Instead, he relayed the story using an analogy of an ancient path traveled by awakened ones in the distant past. His account was not of discovering the path, but of rediscovering it. The Dharma is bigger than the Buddha, but it is true that he is the one who has uncovered it and shared it most recently. So the third characteristic that I love about the Dharma, these are three that are, for me, if somebody else got up here and gave a talk, they might say three different things. This is just my experience. I mentioned that I was active with the Quakers for many years. One of the things I loved was the way that the individual is trusted to find her own way. They used to say, God didn't stop speaking to humankind 2,000 years ago. Unprogrammed meetings like the one in Charlotte have no ordained clergy because of the understanding that no intermediary is necessary between one and God. So stepping out of that religious context, I see the same thing in an insight meditation, a deep trust that each practitioner can work out her own awakening. And this trust is reflected in many ways. When we participate in insight meditation, we are not asked to subscribe to any creed. We take no oaths, and we are free to investigate as we see fit. The Buddha did that himself. He studied for 5 years with two of the top teachers of his time. He distinguished himself to the point that each of them invited him to join them in leading the communities. But in each case, he determined that the teachings were not sufficient and he left. Ultimately, the story goes, he sat down under the Bodhi tree and vowed not to get up until he had awakened. Without his own investigation and experimentation, he would not have done so. If you ever find yourself questioning whether a contemplated activity or practice is allowable, remember the path the Buddha followed to his own awakening, his own experimentation and his own investigation. So I'm going to give you one more story here. There's a great example of following and doing your own investigation and following it where it leads you right here in our time. Some of you may be familiar with the Theravada monk, Bhikkhu Analaya. So he's an extraordinary scholar and practitioner, and he's held in high regard in Theravadan circles. In 2003, he authored a widely respected book entitled Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization. And in it, he explored in great detail, 300 pages, the 11-page Satipatthana Sutta. Some of you may be familiar with this sutta, often referred to as the four foundations of mindfulness. It's one of the most widely taught and practiced practices of the Dharma. And in this teaching, the Buddha offered 13 practices for cultivating mindfulness. These 13 practices fall into four categories: the body, feeling tone, mind states, and dhammas. Now, after having devoted years to his first book on Satipatthana, 10 years later, in 2013, he authored a second book, Perspectives on Satipatthana. Here, another 300 pages, he proposed that the widely revered 13 practices, which he had so thoroughly investigated, were not accurate. He proposed that 6 of the 13 had been added later, and that the original sutta was only composed of 7 practices. His book was thoroughly researched, and his conclusions were well documented. So in many traditions, taking this kind of a controversial stand would have resulted in somebody being run out of town on a rail. In the insight meditation community, Bhikkhu Analayo continues to be widely respected and sought after as a teacher. In practicing the Dhamma, we don't find someone telling us we must do things a certain way. Instead, we find the wisdom of cause and effect. It is not that we must avoid acting in unskillful ways. Instead, if we behave in skillful ways, we can expect favorable results. And if we behave in unskillful ways, we can expect unfavorable results. We're free to make our choices, and we'll experience the results that accord with those choices. So this confidence in the practitioner, this third thing that I'm so enamored with, informs the way insight meditation communities operate. We don't engage in persuasion. Unlike many spiritual traditions, we simply make the teachings widely available as we are able, as our resources allow, and then we allow the response of others to determine our growth or our lack thereof. It's really applying right effort and then not attaching to results. Likewise, we don't solicit funds. The option of making a donation is available, but it's up to each practitioner to determine whether to give, and if so, how much. This long-standing tradition of dana in the East has not been translated perfectly to the West. In the East, families consider it a responsibility to support the Dhamma through monastic communities, and the sense of responsibility has been handed down for many generations. But this is an unfamiliar tradition here in the West. So we do point out there's a way to donate that wouldn't be done in the East. What I hope you will never hear in an insight meditation sangha is a request that you give. Instead, what I hope you'll hear is an invitation to engage with the question of supporting the Dhamma. This is not semantics. It's a critical distinction that reflects confidence in the practitioner. And more important than any specific gift is to engage with the practice of Dhamma. I have a friend who, like me, had a career in finance. When she would attend events that we sponsor, she would say to me, just tell me how much to give and I will give it, but don't leave me hanging out there. Unfortunately for her, the hanging out there is a part of the process whereby we cultivate a knowing of the right amount to give. As you begin this unfamiliar process, if it's new to you, you may on occasion feel like you got it wrong. But over time, you'll develop a relationship with giving that feels correct to you. Denise mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again. One way to engage with this is to ask yourself, what is an amount that will not cause me to regret having given too little, but also not cause me to regret having given too much? Finally, when we hear the term insight meditation, we might think this practice is solely about meditation, but nothing could be further from the truth. The Buddhist teachings upon which insight meditation are based offer a comprehensive way of being in the world. The skills we develop, the insights we attain during meditation practice apply throughout our lives, our work, our family, romance, public service, religious communities, and everywhere else. So in summary, for me, the path of insight meditation has been, to use an overused phrase, profoundly life-changing. Each of us must explore the possibilities and choose a path that's right for us. What insight meditation offers is a culture that supports the practitioner's own personal experience, humility in the way she relates to the world, and confidence that she herself can discern a skillful way forward in her life. The purpose of IMC Charlotte is to enable you to explore this option.